Hello, bachcho. Let's see the question. So the question says, who isolated the first restriction endonucleases? So out of the four given options, we need to identify the scientist who first discovered or isolated the restriction endonuclease. So the key concept in this question is the discovery of restriction endonuclease. So restriction endonuclease is an enzyme that cleaves DNA sequences only at specific sites in the middle region of the DNA and not from the sides of the DNA. Now, in 1960, a scientist named Werner Arber first hypothesized the presence of restriction endonucleases. So he observed a very dramatic change in the bacteriophage DNA when it infected certain bacterial strains. So this bacteriophage DNA was degraded or broken down or cut into smaller fragments due to the presence of certain bacterial enzymes. So these bacterial enzymes cut the viral DNA into smaller fragments. So Werner Arber named these enzymes as the restriction enzymes. Now, Werner Arber observed that these enzymes only were specific to the viral DNA and did not degrade the bacterial DNA. So he said or hypothesized that these enzymes were site specific. He also hypothesized that these enzymes only recognized a particular nucleotide sequence in the viral DNA, which he named them as the recognition site. So the restriction enzymes recognized only these recognition sequences and cleaved the viral DNA only at that particular site. So this was the hypothesis given by Werner Arber. Then later in 1970s around, a scientist named Hamilton Smith was the first scientist to isolate the first restriction endonuclease. So he named this enzyme as HIND2. So HIND2 is the first restriction endonuclease discovered by Hamilton Smith, and this enzyme was isolated from a bacteria named Haemophilus influenza. Now Hamilton Smith observed that this enzyme HIND2 only recognized a particular DNA sequence. So it recognized a 6 nucleotide base pair sequence, that is GTC, GAC, and its complementary strand. So HIND2 recognized only this 6 base pair sequence and cleaved the DNA into 2 fragments by attacking on this site. So HIND2 cleaved the DNA fragment into DNA sequence into 2 fragments like this. So now we had 2 DNA fragments cleaved at a specific site. So in this way, HIN2, which is a restriction endonuclease, recognize only a specific DNA sequence present in the DNA and cleaves the DNA into two fragments by acting as an endonuclease only at a specific site. So this is how the HIND2 functions. Therefore, the first restriction endonuclease was isolated by the scientist Hamilton Smith. So now if we go through the options, then the first option is Temin and Baltimore. So they were the first scientists who discovered the enzyme reverse transcriptase. The second option is Sanger. So Sanger was the first scientist who designed the technique for DNA sequencing. That is finding out the nucleotide sequence in the DNA. Then the third option is Smith. So Hamilton Smith was the first scientist to isolate a restriction endonuclease. And the final option is Berg. So Berg was responsible for designing the first recombinant DNA. So he was the first scientist who made a DNA consisting of DNA from two different organisms. So he introduced the virus SV40 gene into the human DNA and formed the first recombinant DNA. So now if we see the options, then the scientist who first isolated the restriction endonuclease will be option 3, that is Smith. Temin Baltimore discovered a reverse transcriptase, so this won't be our answer. Sanger was responsible for DNA sequencing, so again this won't be our answer. And Berg was responsible for designing the first recombinant DNA, so again this won't be our answer. So our final answer to this question is option 3. That is Smith. So Smith was the first who isolated the first restriction endonuclease. Hope you understood this well. Best of luck. Thank you.